Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Bela Gandhi and I will be your host for this webinar. We invite you to participate in our polls on the screen. Let us know where you're listening from and how you heard about this webinar. In way of announcements today, our next webinar is entitled Understanding Extracted Records in Family Search Family Tree by Kathryn Grant, which is scheduled for May 18th at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. For those of you who are having trouble accessing our webinars on YouTube, we have a new platform where we are slowly downloading all of our videos. The link to the platform is on the main page of our website, which I have put in the announcement box below. Please feel free to check it out. Let us know what you think. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. And we really appreciate just constructive feedback and suggestions. So today we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation entitled Learning to Love Family History Research. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn started doing family history and discovered a new passion. Her specialty is mentoring new family historians and helping them find success, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton Saturday seminars and other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. Kathryn works for the LDS Church as a technical writer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thoughtful and provoking books, and homemade guacamole. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us and remind you as Kathryn gets things loaded up here about our comments and question boxes on the right-hand side of the screen. Any questions that you have, write them in and we'll make sure that they get answered by the end of the presentation. Kathryn, whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Okay, sounds great. Bela, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for joining us today. I am really excited about this webinar. I've seen a great need for this topic, and I hope that it's helpful to you that are listening, whether you're the new person who's starting out and just wondering how on earth you're going to learn to love research, or whether you're the consultant maybe who's helping somebody learn to love research. So I'm really happy to be with you today. So, too many people feel like this about research. Have any of you ever felt that way? So the question arises, why? Why do some people have such negative reactions to research? And then why does it even matter? And finally, how can we change things? If someone is having a negative experience with research, especially family history research, how can we make that better? So first of all, why the negative reaction to family history research for some people? Well, as I've worked with people over the years, there's a number of different reasons. Probably most of us can relate to at least one of these or possibly more. So first of all, we might have had bad experiences in the past. I remember being in high school and receiving a research paper assignment and feeling completely overwhelmed. I didn't feel that I had the knowledge or the skills or the understanding. Honestly, I felt like I was staring into some kind of a black hole with no idea how to get out. And I still remember that after all these years. Maybe some of you do also with research papers in either high school or college or whatever, or even research that you've been asked to do on the job. And when you have a bad experience like that, it tends to stay with you. And anytime somebody hears the word research, if they've had a bad experience, they're probably going to remember those negative feelings. Another problem is that we hear other people complain about research. So have you ever heard a child Maybe they've said, "Oh, I love school so much. I just enjoy it so much." But then one of their little peers starts talking about how much they hate school. And all of a sudden, this child who loved school before is talking negatively about school. So when we hear other people complain, sometimes we think, well, gosh, they're right. Yeah, this is terrible. This is bad. So complaints can spread and can make those negative feelings become more common among people. Another reason sometimes people have a negative reaction when they hear about research, especially family history research, is that they haven't yet realized the benefits. So people complain a lot about research, it's tedious or difficult or whatever, but a lot of times people don't spread the benefits as much as they do the complaints. And then also another huge roadblock is that people simply don't know how. I've had so many people tell me that as I've helped them get started with family history, that is actually one of their biggest fears is simply not even having a clue where to start because it's so completely new to them. And then finally, we're dealing, especially now, with our wonderful technology, with some unrealistic expectations. We have some people telling other people that because of technology, research is old school and it's no longer necessary. And so these people come, for instance, to a family history center or perhaps to a class at church or something like that, and they come with the expectation that they should not have to do research. And so when someone tries to encourage them to do research, they're understandably either disappointed or frustrated or overwhelmed or whatever. So that those unrealistic expectations can also provoke negative reactions in people. So those are some of the reasons. Why does it even matter? So some people don't like broccoli. I don't try to convince people to like broccoli if they don't like it. So why do I want to, and I happen to love broccoli actually, but why would I care if, and why would any of us as family historians care if someone just doesn't like research? Well, there's a few good reasons to care if somebody doesn't like research. For one thing, there are negative consequences like the following. So, some people that don't like research or have gotten it in their minds that it's a terrible negative thing, because of that, they will avoid family history. And that's completely understandable. Why would we want to engage in an activity where we feel that a major part of it is going to be something that we hate or something that we simply are not equipped to do? So that's one negative consequence of a bad taste in your mouth about research. Another problem, but it's kind of the opposite extreme, is that people will still do the will still do the family history, but they will avoid the research. So they will use technology, for instance, like name finding apps that crawl the tree looking for temple work, and they will say, well, I don't need to do research. I can just, use these name finding apps and get my family history done, which of course is not correct. And as a result of avoiding research, we see some negative consequences follow that. One of them is a very common one is that people will make avoidable mistakes, mistakes that could have easily been prevented if they had just done even some basic research. And then, of course, those mistakes go on to cause other problems like duplicate temple work or people building pedigrees on an incorrect person. The other day, I was working on a family where, in fact, I mentioned this in an earlier webinar, that somebody had combined 4 families into one. And so this family had like 20 kids. But when I was working with a stake member and when we looked at it, we realized that they were 4 separate families. But because the family had been combined, wrong temple work had been done, and also people were building off that incorrect family. So those mistakes just tend to multiply once they're made. And then also, unfortunately, when people have a negative idea about research and think that it's just not necessary anymore, they tend to promote those misconceptions among other people. So they will say it from the pulpit, or they will say it in a class, or so forth. And so those misconceptions then spread because avoiding research, wow, doesn't that sound great? If we could avoid something that we think is tedious, difficult, and terrible. So those misconceptions get spread very quickly by word of mouth. And so finally, what happens is avoiding research actually slows down the work of family history. It gets in the way of doing family history. When, for example, it results in duplicate temple work, that means that all that time that was spent doing the duplicate work was not spent on people who really needed the temple work. So in that way and other ways, as you can imagine, it slows down the work of family history instead of hastening it. So given those negative results, then how can we change things? If you're the person who has that negative experience with research and doesn't even want to do it, how can we change that? Or if you're the person who is helping others, how can you help others have a better feeling about research and be more willing to do it? Well, the first and most important thing, and what's interesting to me is I actually had not originally included this slide in the presentation, and as I was working on it, I had a strong feeling to include it. So that just underscores to me the importance of this particular concept right here, and that is seeking the spirit. Honestly, in family history, the spirit changes everything. When we have the spirit with us, tasks that seemed impossible are suddenly doable. Tasks that seemed unpleasant suddenly become enjoyable. The spirit makes all the difference in the world. As people who love family history or who want to love family history, we could take this scripture from it's the experience of the people in 3rd Nephi. After the Savior came to them, they had probably had a pretty overwhelming day. So they had just been through massive destruction, 3 days of darkness, and then suddenly the Savior of the world appears to them after having completed the glorious atonement and resurrection. And I can just imagine what was going on with them. How overwhelming and incredible that must have been. So at the end of that experience, the end of that first day, the Savior said, "Okay, I need to leave for a while, but prepare yourselves because I will come back tomorrow." So what was one of the main things that they did to prepare themselves? They sought the Spirit. They sought the Holy Ghost. As the scripture says, they sought what they most desired, that the Holy Ghost should be given to them. And do you know, it's the same way for family history in my experience. If we seek what we most desire to have the Spirit with us, then somehow it works out. We find what we need to find. We learn what we need to learn. We do the research that we need to do. So, as people who are doing family history or encouraging others to do family history, let's always remember the importance of the Spirit and how the Spirit makes everything better when we're doing family history. Also, we need to be positive and encouraging. So if we're the person who maybe has had bad feelings about family history family history research in the past, one thing we could do is kind of let those feelings sit on the shelf, at least set them aside for a while and be willing to consider that maybe family history research could be positive instead of such a negative thing. Or if we're helping other people, we can avoid complaining about it. We can speak positively about research and positively about people's ability to do it. So we never want to say to somebody, "Oh, you'll hate this," or "You can't do this," or "This is so difficult and terrible and hard." We just always want to have that good attitude and be encouraging because honestly, attitude really is a game changer. Another thing that we want to do is correct misconceptions about research, particularly again in family history. But this really applies to all areas of our life, but we're in the context of family history here. So truth really is freedom. When we have misconceptions, we're in a sort of bondage, if you will, where when we don't know the truth, we really aren't free. So truth really does set us free. What are some of the most common misconceptions that I've seen when working with people on family history? Well, one of them is simply that research is too hard. I wish I had a dollar for every time somebody had said that, and I could probably retire. But the truth is, and we want to be balanced here. We don't want to say, oh, the opposite of research is too hard is that you should tell everybody that research is easy, because that's always not always. Okay, wait a minute. Let me try that again. That is also not always the case. The truth is, to say research is always hard, that's a vast overgeneralization. But to say it's easy is as well. The truth is, sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's easy. And what that depends on is the time period and the location and other factors like the person's name or the availability of the records or so forth. But the key to being successful, if we're starting out in family history, honestly, is work in the easy place. Don't dive right into, say, 17th century German handwriting if you've got no experience with that. That would be overwhelming for most of us. So when we're starting out or helping someone else start out, we start them in the easy place. And then they don't have this misconception that all family history research is just too hard. Here's another misconception that I hear often is that research is boring or tedious. This is also an overgeneralization. To be honest, sometimes it is. There are times when it's boring and tedious, but there are also times when it's absolutely thrilling. And we try to focus on those times when we're trying to help people learn how to do family history research. We guide them towards the exciting discoveries. I'm not saying here that they have to be, these kind of you wouldn't believe it once in a million kind of discoveries, but a simple discovery of just finding a missing child can be exciting. So I'm talking about experiences that touch hearts and that are thrilling in that regard. So it depends on the task of the research. It depends on the skill of the researcher. So we don't immediately send teenagers to drive on the freeway when they're learning to drive. My dad took me to the church parking lot. So in essence, for my first driving lessons. So when we're helping somebody start out, we metaphorically take them to the church parking lot. We let them start with something simple and let them build their skills line upon line. And then, of course, having the Spirit with us is going to help that research. Even when it would ordinarily be boring and tedious, having the Spirit with you will make it a lot less so. Here's another misconception that makes me sad when I hear it, but I hear it a lot, especially with older people who feel maybe some hesitancy about, quote, modern technology, and they will say, I'm just not smart enough. Do you know what? I have never found that to be true. Anyone can learn. What it takes is a good teacher, and it also takes the Spirit. So, and when I say good teacher, I'm not talking about someone with credentials or vast training or anything. I'm talking about someone who, number one, has the Spirit, and then also someone who's patient and loving. And so when a teacher is patient and loving, they can help a person develop skills and talents that they didn't think they could. And they also will start them out at the right level. So a good teacher will not throw that person into 17th century German handwriting, but instead they'll help this person start with the basics and build skills line upon line. So here is the misconception that probably troubles me the most, with the possible exception of the last one that we'll look at in just a minute. But saying that research is old school and not necessary actually sets people up for failure. I've had friends tell me that they hear this even taught from the pulpit or they hear it taught in classes, and this is simply not true. And we're actually going to see some examples of why this is not true after we get through the misconceptions. But the truth is that research is needed now more than ever. because we are getting more people involved in genealogy than ever before, and technology is making it easier to be involved. It's also opening up some doors for misuse of doing family history. So research is definitely needed now more than it ever was before. And research, honestly, is what hastens the work. So the last misconception I wanted to share with you is that research turns people off. And this also makes me sad because this also sets people up for failure. If you teach teachers don't tell people to research because it's going to turn them off, that it just sets people up for failure and makes it impossible for them to really progress in doing family history. The truth that I found in my experience is that research turns hearts. Just recently, I had the most wonderful experience with a couple in my stake. I'm the stake lead consultant in my stake at this time, and I, I was preparing a discovery experience for them and found two missing children. And so when I met with them, I walked them through and helped them repeat the research that I had done. And all of us were just about in tears as we found these two missing children and added them to the family in family trees so that their temple work could be done. That day, I saw the power of research in turning hearts, and that's not a unique experience. I've seen that so many times. So when research is understood correctly and not as this horrible, burdensome thing, then it really can turn hearts. So the last point that I wanted to make about how to help change those misconceptions, or that I should say that those negative feelings about research, we change those by providing or by gaining knowledge. Knowledge really is power, especially in doing family history. So I wanted to cover three things in this section of the webinar. First of all, what exactly is research? Have you ever kind of smiled to yourself when you've heard somebody say that they hate something, and then you ask them, well, have you ever done this, or have you ever tasted it, or have you ever, had experience with it? And they sheepishly admit, well, no. And I think that's often the case with research. I mean, I've done that too, to be honest with you. I've had a negative attitude about something that I honestly didn't understand. And as soon as I grew to understand it, the negative attitude went away. So we want to take a look at what exactly research is. Then we want to look at why research is still valuable, why it's not, quote, old school. And then also, I wanted to share with you just a few of what I would call principles of success, or as I've sometimes called it, what I wish I'd known when starting out. Because when I started out with family history, oh, I don't know, it's been like 10, 12, 15 years or something. When I started out, I did not get good training. And so, in fact, I got almost no training at all. I was called as a ward consultant, and I really had no clue what I was doing. And I remember just learning, oh my gosh, I learned so many things the hard way by making mistakes and messing things up. And over time, I started to collect principles that I had wished I had known that would have helped me avoid making those mistakes. So we'll talk about a few of those. So first of all, what exactly is research? Well, to find out, I turned to Google. I did a define research search on Google. I don't know if you've ever tried that. I think it was James Tanner that taught me that. Like I learned it at a class that he taught or whatever. So if you go to Google and you just type in define and then the word you want to define, it pulls up a dictionary definition for you, complete with usage and etymology and everything. So it's really cool. So this was the simple definition that Google gave a few, but this was the simple definition that I liked the most. Discover facts by investigation. Well, that's not hard. That's totally doable. We do that all the time. I want to buy a new book. So I want to do some research on it. So I search on Google and I look at some reviews. I see who liked it, what they said about it, who didn't like it, et cetera, et cetera. That's discovering facts by investigation. We want to find a new school for our child. We want to find a new home. Any number of different things in our life where we need information. We discover facts by investigation. That's not hard. That's doable, right? We can do that. Sure, some of it's harder than others, but research is not this impossible black hole task that people can't do. It's just a matter of discovering facts by investigation. And as a writer, Bela mentioned that I write for the church. I am a word nerd. I've got to admit, I love words. I love learning about them. So I did look at the etymology of research. And I had not known this before. I discovered that it comes from the Old French re, so that's to express intensive force, the re, and that's the same thing that we see at the beginning of the word rejoice, for example. So it's not just joy, it's intensive joy, it's strong joy. And then the second half of the word of research comes from chercher, which just means to search. So I love that because to me that says it's strong searching. And that just sounds wonderful. That's powerful searching that enables our ancestors to eventually have their temple work done. So why is research still valuable? Now that we've got maybe a more accurate idea of what research really is, why do we still need it? The answers are found in understanding Family Search Family Tree. So most of us, when we're doing family research, family history research, it's going to touch on using Family Search Family Tree. Almost always that's going to be our end result. We may take different steps along the way. We may add photos and stories. We may write a biography. We may record audio interviews of our family members. But ultimately, most of the time in my experience, people do want to get some temple work done for their ancestors. So in order to understand why research is still valuable when we're dealing with Family Search Family Tree, then we need to understand a little bit more about Family Tree. Now, I do realize that some of you listening will look at this and you'll say, well, yeah, I'm already familiar with the principles you're teaching about Family Search Family Tree. If that's you, then I hope that these principles might give you some ideas for teaching others. So let's take a look. What exactly is Family Tree? As it happens, Family Tree gets mixed up with a couple of other things. It gets mixed up with Family Search and it gets mixed up with historical records. So I wanted to point out that Family Tree is one section of the FamilySearch.org website. And here I've got the whole menu of the FamilySearch.org website. So you can see that it's one section of the 5 different sections on the website. So it's not the same thing as FamilySearch.org. It's actually a piece of FamilySearch.org. It's also not the same thing as search. So if you click search here, you get taken to Family Search Historical Records, and that is the place where you can find birth records, marriage records, census records, things like that. So Family Tree and Family Search Historical Records are two completely separate pieces of the FamilySearch.org website. Well, we're not going to dive into historical records today except very lightly in terms of Family Tree, but we do want to look deeper at what Family Tree is. So, what is Family Tree? It's where we are creating a common pedigree of the human family. And to my knowledge, this has never been attempted to the extent that Family Search is doing it. I am aware of one other site that tried to build a one world tree, and it didn't seem to ever gain much traction. Family Search's Family Tree is gaining a lot of traction. It's growing phenomenally, and it is an absolutely amazing endeavor to create one world tree of the world's people, of all of Heavenly Father's children. Family tree is a shared tree, and when you think about the fact that we're trying to build a common tree, it couldn't be anything else. We couldn't have just a bunch of separate user trees like we have on Ancestry or MyHeritage or so forth. It has to be a shared tree. We have to work together on it. So there's no your tree or my tree. We're all working on the same tree. Again, one master tree of all of Heavenly Father's children. Family tree is open edit, and that means that any user can change anything. And it also means that any change that is made affects everyone else. Now, of course, the only place that that's not true is when you're dealing with living records, but for records for deceased people, any change that anybody makes affects everybody else. So we're starting to see why research is still valuable. And that leads us to the next question. Where did family tree names come from? And this is probably one of the most misunderstood aspects of family tree. And so that's why I feel it's so important for people who are beginning research and also for those of us who are helping others do research. That's why it's so important for us to understand this so that we can help other people understand it and gain success in their family history work. Because otherwise, if we don't understand this, then we can very easily make mistakes that we had totally not intended to make. So the first source of information in Family Tree is LDS Church temple records. That includes extracted vital records. So for those of you who may have done family history quite a while ago, you'll probably remember that the church had an extraction program that's very similar to today's indexing program. At the time, the the church was not having enough names to provide for patrons who came to the temple. So they started this extraction program, which was basically just writing down names from historical records. And then those names were given to patrons who came to the temple to do the temple work. And then all that information ultimately ended up in Family Tree. Well, of course, all those records that came from the temple records either had all or some of the ordinances completed. Then also family tree names come from LDS Church membership records. I found that out when my uncle passed away. After his church membership record was marked deceased, then his information showed up in Family Tree, including his temple records or temple ordinances. And then also the other major source of the names in Family Tree is user submissions. Those can be GEDCOM files, those can be submissions from 4-generation programs. They can be submissions that were made to old versions, if you will, of Family Tree, like the old quote new Family Search, if any of you use that, and any of the previous iterations like the IGI or the TIB. That information was added. Um, any user submissions that were made to any of those previous systems ultimately ended up in Family Tree. So what does that mean for us when we're doing family history? What does that mean when we're looking at this information in Family Tree? Well, for one thing, the quality of the information varies widely because it was contributed by all types of people with all levels of expertise. So some people who submitted names for temple work in the old systems were professional researchers. Others had moderate skills. Others were just starting out and doing the best they could to learn how to do family history. So we've got all kinds of quality of names in Family Tree. And then duplicate names are common. In fact, they're an ongoing concern because sometimes people don't understand that Family Tree is a common tree. So they see that names are already in there, but they're trying to upload, quote, their tree. So they are under the misconception that their tree that they upload is going to be separate, and they don't realize that it's a problem to upload duplicate names. And I keep running across duplicates, and so that's something that we want to be really careful of when we're working with the names in Family Tree. So research matters because Family Search does not verify all those names that we just talked about, those names of varying quality. A lot of people that I've talked with or have heard about are under that impression that all the names in Family Tree must have been validated by the church because it's a church program. But the fact is, Family Search gave us Family Tree as a tool to do family history, not as a pool of pre-validated names. So Family Search does not validate or verify the names in Family Tree, and the church does not verify the names in Family Tree. The truth is that verification is our job, and it's actually a wonderful privilege to be able to do that. And it's a really exciting part of family history. There's another reason that research matters. Family Tree contains about 1.2 billion names. This figure was announced by Ron Tanner Ron Tanner is a manager at Family Search. He's the top manager over Family Tree. And so I believe he gave that, I want to say it was at a recent genealogy conference. So at that time, it was 1.2 billion names. It's probably a little bit more now, maybe up to 1.3, I don't know, but it's around this amount. So that's the number of names that are currently in Family Tree. Guess what? Population experts estimate that about 110 billion people have lived on the earth. So if you subtract about 1 billion from 110 billion, that leaves us with 109 billion people approximately who ultimately need to be added to Family Tree. So we aren't going to find those people by looking in Family Tree. We're going to find these precious people by doing, you guessed it, research. We're going to find it by looking in historical records, finding birth records, marriage records, all those records that give us the information that we need to do those people's temple work. So let's talk finally about those principles of success, or what I wish I had known when I was starting out to do family history. First of all, it took me a while to figure out exactly what I was doing when I was trying to, quote, do family history. One way of stating it is that the purpose of research is to find enough information to identify a person uniquely. What makes this John Bescovy different than that John Bescovy? Or what makes this James Stuffins different from that James Stuffins? How do I tell them apart? And that becomes especially critical when you're doing temple work. And it's also a little bit more difficult for the dead than it is in real life. In real life, we can see people, we can see their faces, we get to know them. But when we're just relying on a paper trail, on records, it's a little bit more challenging. So it took me a while to honestly to figure out what was going on. So the way we identify a person uniquely is done mainly through birth, marriage, and death, or what we call vital events. And for each of those, we want a date and a place when possible. And then also it's done through relationships. And the two relationships which are the foundation for every other relationship are spouse to spouse and parent to child. Every other relationship can be derived from those relationships. So we identify a person uniquely through vital events, birth, marriage, and death, dates and places, and relationships. Now, how do we find those vital events and those relationships? And here's another thing that I didn't get right away when I started learning to do family history. Every place or geographical location and every time period, like, century or whatever, each one of those has key records that help you identify people uniquely. So here's an example of doing English research. So key records for England are parish registers, which go from about the 1500s to the present, Civil registration, oh, and parish registers, for those of you who may not have used those before, those are church records. So those are, for instance, in England, most of them were kept by the Church of England, and they were for christenings or infant baptisms, marriages, and burials or deaths. And so those parish registers are a key record for England. Civil registration is also, and civil registration are records, those are records that were kept by the government of births, marriages, and deaths. And then finally, census records are key records for doing family history research. And you notice I've got the dates here of when those records are available. So when you're researching in England, you can be very successful by using these records and by sticking to the times and places that provide these records. So that's a principle of success, is work in the area where you can find the information that you need to find. Now, of course, what about the people that were born, earlier, or what about the people that were born in areas where there's not as good of records? Well, of course, we want to eventually do those, or there will be people with those skills. It's that line upon line thing. It's just when we're starting out or helping someone else start out, we want to give somebody a success experience. And so we don't want to dive into the most difficult stuff. We want to learn in the easier areas. So where are these key records? That is another question that often people will ask at the beginning. It's like, okay, fine, you've told me I need to use parish registers and civil registration and censuses, but I do not even have a clue where to find those. How? And I remember when I was first starting out, this just seemed like a big black hole because I just thought records, good grief, that like the world is the limit. How do I even draw boundaries? How do I even know what's possible or where to look? Well, fortunately, with the internet, it's all become a lot easier and a lot clearer, I think. So first of all, these key records can be found, many of them can be found in Family Search historical records. And if you remember when we were looking at that menu of Family Search, you find these records by clicking that search option that is right next to Family Tree. But there's other places. So Family Search has partnered with some providers of historical records. And those partners include Ancestry.com, Find My Past, and MyHeritage, and a few others that you can see if you go to familysearch.org/partner access. Members of the LDS Church can sign up for free access to these partner sites, which would normally charge money. This was arranged with these partner sites because the church and they came to an agreement and did some records exchanges and so forth. And so one of the conditions was that these providers would allow members of the church to have free access. So that is a wonderful blessing to people who are trying to do more research on these sites and might normally not be able to afford the subscription fee, which can run into the hundreds of dollars. And then finally, another place to learn about how to find these key records is the amazing Family Search Wiki. So if you've never been there, I would recommend checking it out. It has pages for many, many geographical locations. And last I checked, the number of pages was somewhere around, I don't know, 85,000. It's probably more by now. So this wiki has a lot of information. If you go to it and you search for England, then it's going to bring up a page that tells you what records are available for searching in England. Same thing for Germany, same thing for France, same thing for many, many other countries. It doesn't have every country in the world, but chances are it has most or maybe all of the countries that your ancestors were from. So if you're wondering what records to use for a certain country, or maybe you've tried, like let's just suppose you're doing English research and you've already tried the parish registers and the civil registration and the censuses and you haven't found what you need, then you can go to the wiki and see what else is available. Like, what about military records or what about wills? And very often it will give you links or information that will help you actually bring up those records online. Or if not online, it will help you know how to, where those records are stored, where you could either, you know, travel there if you've got the means, make a visit, or perhaps get someone who lives there to help you with the research, that type of thing. But I can't say enough good about the Family Search Wiki. I used to joke actually a few years back that it just reminded me of Ross Dress for Less, where you'd have to dig through a lot of junk to find that one, wonderful dress or shirt or whatever. That is no longer the case. It has gone way past Ross Dress for Less. It's now, I think, a key resource that will help you find information on how to do research. So I can't recommend the wiki highly enough. I think this is the last one. It's either the last one or second to last. Principle that I wanted to go over is use what you know to discover what you don't know. So here's an example of what I mean by that. So suppose that I know the wife and the children of one of my ancestors, but I don't know his parents. And then suppose that in my research I find an obituary. Well, in the obituary, it lists his wife and children, so I know the obituary is his. And that's what I know. Then I discover that this obituary lists the names of his parents. And so that means now I know the parents' names and I can use that information to find out more information. For instance, possibly find those parents in the census. Every time I get stuck or lost in family history or when I don't know what to do, it's because I've forgotten this principle. So if I go back to what I know, that will always help me. I shouldn't say always, often help me build a bridge so that I can discover what I don't know. Okay, and here's the last one, tips for helpers. These are things that you can do if you're helping other people who are struggling with learning to love research. First of all, one thing is to point out that research is much easier than it used to be. Sometimes when you're trying to help people love research, they will have visions in their head of going to musty basements and digging through boxes of moldy records. Or they will have ideas of going to the Family History Center and struggling to put a microfilm on the reader and rolling the microfilm until your arm is just about to drop off. And so they have these visions of, this terrible, difficult experience with family history. Well, that's not how it is anymore. For one thing, so many records are online, not all of them, but many are. And even for those that are microfilmed, if you go to the Salt Lake Library or the Riverton Family Search Library, one of the places that will still let you use microfilms, they have these fancy new readers that are digital. And so you put and they've got a paper right there that tells you exactly how to thread the microfilm into the reader. So you put it on, it shows up on a screen and you just click a button. It shows up on a monitor. So you just click a button to make it scroll. There's no rolling, rolling till your arm drops off. And then when you get to the image that you want, you take a screenshot of it and put it on your thumb drive. So gone are the days where you have to, do these tedious microfilm things. You can just use the new readers and it's wonderful. And then you've got the screenshot of what you wanted from that film. So research really is so much easier than it used to be. Not only that, the church, you're probably, many of you may be aware that the church has recently announced, and by recent, I mean the date this webinar is being given, which is May 4th, 2018. The church has recently announced an expanded emphasis to family history called Discover, Gather, Connect. And when we focus on helping people discover, that's really what research is. And so helping someone discover things about their ancestor is helping them learn to love that person, learn about them, find out facts about their life, connect with them, and That's really research. We're just maybe calling it by a different name. And who doesn't love a discovery? Who doesn't love a treasure hunt or, scavenger hunt, something like that? We always love discovering things. So if we focus on the discovery aspect of research, that is going to help people find the joy in doing family history research. Also, it helps to explain why records are relevant. Sometimes I found this as a consultant, I will look at the record, and because I'm familiar, say, with an English parish register, I know exactly what I'm looking at when I bring the record up. But to the person who's never seen a parish record, parish register, they look at it and go, I really do not know what I'm looking at. And none of us do when we first start out. So as a helper, you want to kind of walk through that record you found through research, and explain why it's relevant. Okay, here's the person's name, and here's the date of the christening. And oh, look, outside in the margin, the clergyman wrote the birth date. And look over here on the right-hand side, we've got the father's occupation, and it matches the census. So now we've got some additional proof that we've got the right person, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't just like say, okay, here's the record, but instead you explain why it matters, why it's relevant to them. And especially closely tied to that, explain how it helps them know their family. Highlight the occupation, especially if it's unusual. I had one person on my line that was a color man, and I had no idea what that was, so I Googled it and found out that it was someone who worked with dyes and paints and so forth. So one of my ancestors worked with dyes and paints. That was pretty cool to me, and it was a pretty unusual occupation. You can talk about where they lived and even look on Google Earth and find out, they lived in Grimsby, Lincolnshire. What is that place? Let's look it on Google Earth and see if we can see some pictures of it. How many kids did they have? Did they have a huge family, a small family? Were they all boys? Were they all girls? Or on the other hand, I remember, gosh, bringing up one census record where they had had 7 children and 5 of them had passed away. And you can't see something like that without having empathy for that family and without feeling a connection to them. And for any of us who have ever lost someone we loved, which is most likely all of us, then we feel that empathy for that family, and it helps us just feel a little bit more of what their life was like and what they went through. And especially imagine that if that person did not have the gospel, what did they understand about their children? What grief did they endure not knowing that they could see those children again and that those kids would be with them forever? So you can make research meaningful. Oh my goodness. Okay, this just touches my heart. So you can make research meaningful by focusing on things that are meaningful to the person that you're helping and helping them really connect with that family. And even some interesting names. I'll give an example of that. In England, a lot of people back in the 1800s would name their children after the kings and the queens. So we had a lot of Williams, we had a lot of Jameses, we had Henrys and so forth, or we had Marys and Elizabeths. But when people were when they realized that the state church, the Church of England, was not the true church, but they didn't know the restored gospel yet, they would often turn to Bible names. These people were called nonconformists because they didn't conform with the Church of England, with the state church. And so they would name their kids Rebecca and Isaac and Jacob and so forth. And so that's another interesting thing to point out to somebody, that if their family, just as again with this English example, if they were living in England at that time and used Bible names, they were very likely nonconformists who recognized that the true gospel as taught in the Bible was not in the state church. And when I've pointed that out to people, they have loved that because they can see how those people were being prepared to receive the restored gospel. So those are just some tips for helping people learn to love family history research. So that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. So just a quick review of what we covered. We talked about why research sometimes has a bad name with people. We talked about why that matters, why it's important. What are the negative consequences of having a bad feeling about research and avoiding it? And then finally, we talked about how we can change things. We talked about the importance of having the spirit with us as we do research and help others learn to love research. We talked about the importance of being positive, encouraging other people. We talked about how to correct misconceptions, and we gave examples of misconceptions that need to be corrected, such as that research is old school, which is actually not true. And then finally, we talked about the importance of gaining knowledge or providing that knowledge for other people. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today, and thank you so much for joining us. Bela, do we have any questions that we need to address?
We have a couple. Our first, what are your feelings about the 5 phases of research as outlined in Family Search Family Tree in the Research Wiki? Is this a good way to
Oh my
teach basic
goodness, that is
research?
such a good question. And I would say that it depends on the person. I sometimes work with people that, for instance, I know a policeman who, and there's other professions where by their profession and maybe by their personality, they're very detail oriented, they're very careful, they want all the facts and so forth. For a person who's like that, even if they're starting out, I do talk to them about the research process because they want to know and it's not overwhelming to them. So if that's appropriate for the person, then I do. But on the other hand, there was an occasion when I was working with a 12-year-old girl to put her through the research process, like at our first visit. I don't think that would have been very encouraging to her. I think it would have gotten in the way. It would have taken a long time to explain. So in that case, what I did was I found a quick success experience. I found somebody in a census, and I did the background research to make sure that it was correct. But then to get her familiar with the census, I kind of explained what it was. And then I had her click on the button to open it up and look at it. Then I kind of walked through it and said, okay, this is a record of your ancestor's life, and here she is right here. And you can see that she's this old and she lived in the, was born in this place, and helped her add that person to family tree. So in that's a kind of the opposite spectrum. In that case, I just very basically gave her an experience that gave her a taste of research without describing the whole process. And then there's any level in between that. So honestly, on that one, I would pray and ask Heavenly Father, what is the best way to teach the person about research? What level, what things to include, and so forth. And then with the guidance of the Spirit, you can have a great experience helping that person understand research. And often you'll meet with somebody more than once. So you can kind of go line upon line. The first time, maybe you just show them the census. Then maybe the second time you dig a little deeper and depending, maybe ultimately you do show them the whole research process. So thank you. That was a fantastic question.
Our next question, what do you recommend as a good way to keep track of research when it comes pouring in and you can take any number of avenues? At times, I have difficulty returning to a project due to not having a good form or method of recording my findings prior to entering it into Family
Oh my
Search.
goodness. Okay, you are my kindred spirit, whoever did that. And the way this software works is I can't see anything that Bela's reading to me, so I can't see your name. But you are totally my kindred spirit because I really have to discipline myself on that because I want to go down so many rabbit holes. And also I do have the same challenge when I've gone down a rabbit hole or when I've been disciplined and I've really done something that I intended to do, then I come back to something else and I forget where I am. Yeah, I totally relate to that. So I'll tell you how I have figured out to deal with that. And this is just one way. So this is just one way that I enjoy and that works for me. But you could also Google and find other ways. So I use a research log called the timeline grid. And it's basically a table that allows you to capture information in any order because it's used for countries and time periods that have regular censuses. It's not so helpful before regular censuses or for countries that don't use them. But basically what it is you have a row for every person and a column for every census. And then as you find the information, you just plug it into the right cell in the table. So it's very, very easy. And I put mine in Google Docs. And so I realize this isn't the time or place to go a deep dive into the timeline grid. But if you go back to the webinar page where all of our webinars are listed, there's a webinar, in fact, there's a couple on the timeline grid. And so you can get more information there. And there's also templates that you can use to do the timeline grid. And I love putting them in Google Docs. That's where I will keep all of mine because then I have access to them any place. So if I'm at work and I have a quick minute on my lunch break, I can bring up my timeline grid and do some quick research. Or if I'm at the Family History Library, I'm home or whatever, to answer your other question about how do you keep track of your research, or excuse me, how do you keep track of what you're doing so that you can pick up when you've come back, I just started keeping a really simple to-do list at the top of the timeline grid. So I will just say something like, next time, look for the marriage record of so-and-so, or next time, figure out why, in one census they're a boy and the other they're a girl, figure out, look for some more records and find out what the gender actually is. And so that helps me a lot because then when I come back, I've got this little kind of to-do list that helps refresh my memory. So I hope that helps. Thanks for that question. And thanks for being my kindred spirit.
Well, I believe at the moment that is all our questions. If you do have more questions, please write those in to the question box, and we'll make sure to answer those for you. Kathryn, thank you so much. Do you have anything else to close
I
up?
don't today. Thank you, Bela. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Of course. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope this has been a valuable experience. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to enter in some feedback for us, and also if you have any questions for future webinars, comment below. We love new ideas and ways to improve our webinars. As I mentioned in the beginning of our webinar. Our next webinar will be May 18th with Kathryn Grant, entitled Understanding Extracted Records in Family Search Family Tree. And we hope to see you again at that one. Keep your eye out for this recording to go onto our YouTube channel, and make sure you subscribe to our Facebook and Twitter accounts to stay up to date on the happenings of the BYU Family History Library. And thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you next time.